On the morning of my 71st birthday, I walked into the den and heard my granddaughter say it, not to me, but to her mother. The words came soft, almost playful, as she pointed to the walnut armoire I'd polished for decades. "Jewelry's already hers," she said, gesturing at my things. She spoke as if I had vanished from the room, as though I had already left the room and never come back. "My name is Irene Whitaker." At the age of 71, I realized that my presence had transitioned into absence. This absence was not accompanied by cruelty. It wasn't even a moment of anger, just dismissal. The tone is quiet and casual. Please subscribe and share in the comments where you are watching from. Thanks. That cabinet was my mother's and hers before her. I had moved it from our old brownstone in Queens after Robert passed. The drawers were velvet-lined with love and lineage, not wealth, but memory. I wore a brooch from 1952 to my graduation ceremony. I purchased a pair of clip-on earrings. With my first paycheck, Robert gifted me a locket containing a minuscule photo of Jamie, which required careful tilting in sunlight to reveal his tiny eyes. And yet, during my granddaughter's speak, it had already passed. It wasn't because I had passed away, but rather because my significance had diminished. That morning, no one said happy birthday until I mentioned it myself, half laughing to lighten the sting. There was no cake, no candle. There was just a stack of catalogs on the kitchen table and the faint sound of someone watching television upstairs. I stood there for a moment, holding the cup of tea I had made for myself, and thought, I am not needed here. Worse, I am not seen here. I used to think growing old meant growing smaller in the body, a softening of bones, a thinning of voice. But no one tells you that aging also means seeing your outline fade from the lives of those you once built your world around. And they don't even notice. I had moved in with Jamie and Celia after my fall last spring. They said it was just a hairline fracture, but it was enough to rattle their nerves. At first, they were kind about it, making space in the guest room, setting up a small armchair near the window where I could read in the mornings. But the kindness faded like morning dew, subtly, consistently. I tried to stay out of the way. I timed my showers to coincide with their schedules, prepared my meals when the kitchen was unoccupied, and requested only enough space to store my photographs and books. I didn't anticipate receiving such affection. Just remembered. But days stretched into weeks, and slowly my things began to disappear. Someone discreetly donated a box containing my old records. Unnoticed, Celia threw away my beloved teacup. After it cracked, the blanket I kept at the foot of my bed was replaced with one Celia thought would match better. Everything, it seemed, was being rewritten, relabeled. Even me, and that's when the comment came. A girl of 19, who once clung to my apron when she was frightened of thunderstorms, now spoke about my belongings as if I'd already gone. Like my hands no longer opened those drawers, like my eyes didn't still flicker when I passed that armoire, remembering my youth. I didn't say anything that day. I didn't correct her. I just sipped my tea, let it warm the silence, and folded that moment neatly into the drawer of things I'd never unpack. But that was the moment. They let me go, not with an argument, not with a slammed door. Just with assumption. I went upstairs that evening and opened the armoire. The scent of cedar greeted me, warm, earthy, familiar. I looked at the brooches, the earrings, the lockets. I ran my fingers over the small imperfections in the wood. I stood there longer than I needed to, and I understood something. They didn't want the jewelry. Not really. They wanted the space. It's the certainty of inheritance. It's the comfort of assuming it was already theirs. They didn't know, couldn't know what those pieces meant to me. How I'd held on to them, not out of greed, but out of memory. Not to possess, but to preserve. That night, didn't sleep much. The next morning, I called the local museum, the one with the rotating exhibit on women's personal histories. I asked if they accepted personal donations. Of course. The woman said, especially heirlooms tied to a life story. And so the decision began. Not out of revenge. Not out of pettiness, but because if they no longer saw me, I needed to make sure I left something where I would be seen, not as a burden, not as an afterthought, but as a life fully lived. I wasn't going to be erased quietly. I would exit, yes, but I would write my name on the way out. I didn't become a mother by accident. I became one because I believed in it. Believed in the act of raising, of sacrificing, of loving without conditions. I was 22 when Jamie was born. It was the middle of June 1974, and the heat in the hospital room felt like it was stitched into the walls. Robert had parked the car in the wrong lot and nearly missed the delivery, but I forgave him before I ever held our son. Jamie came out silent and strong, blinking like the world was already asking too much of him. I knew, holding him in my arms, that my life would no longer belong to me. There were things I let go of over the years, big things. The art scholarship I was offered at Pratt, this small townhouse. Robert and I looked at in Montauk, the one with the wild lilac bush and the porch I dreamed of writing letters on. When Robert's job transferred him from Albany to Flushing, I packed everything into boxes without a word of protest. I made every house into a home, hung curtains and rentals we couldn't afford, and gave up my nights so Jamie could have new textbooks or soccer cleats or braces we weren't quite insured for. I made birthday cakes from scratch every single year. Even the year Jamie turned 16 and told me not to bother, that he and his friends were going to the arcade. Okay. I still baked the chocolate cake, left it on the kitchen table with one candle unlit. He never touched it, but I wrapped it in foil anyway, just in case he changed his mind. When Celia entered our lives, I tried to make space for her, too. She was quieter than I expected, ambitious in the way that made her eyes dart toward whatever room she hadn't yet rearranged. She was kind in the beginning. Grateful, even. I remember the first Christmas after their wedding. Embroidered her name into a set of napkins, ivory cotton with thread that matched the china pattern on her registry. She thanked me, smiled, and then never used them. It was small things. Like that at first. I chalked it up to taste, to personality, to the shifting ground between generations. But over time, I began to see how often I folded myself into the corners of their lives, trying not to cast a shadow. When Jamie lost his job in 2003, I gave them my savings. $12,000 I had been putting aside quietly, meant for a trip to Vienna, that Robert and I had once dreamed of. I told him it wasn't much, that I'd never miss it, and maybe I wouldn't have, except for the way they stopped mentioning it, stopped thanking me, stopped remembering it ever came from me at all. I babysat when their sitter canceled. I drove across the city when their car broke down. I bought gifts for birthdays, anniversaries, and graduations, even when my pension barely covered groceries. I even stayed silent when I heard things I shouldn't have heard, offhand comments about how I hovered too much or offered too many opinions, when I was only trying to help. But still, I gave and gave, again gave, because that's what you do when you love someone, right? You don't tally, you don't keep score. You pour, even if the glass never tips back in your direction. There were things they never knew, like the time I pawned a bracelet Robert had given me for our 10th anniversary just to cover a gap in their rent. Or how I skipped my dental appointment for 2 years so I could pay for Haley's clarinet lessons when the school cut music funding. She never stuck with it, but I kept the recital program in a drawer anyway. It's a small reminder that for a moment, I mattered. Love, I've learned, is not always loud. Sometimes it's folding towels exactly the way Celia likes, even when no one thanks you. Sometimes it's sitting through long silences at dinner, pretending not to notice how the conversations move around you like you're a coat rack in the corner. Sometimes love is just showing up, quietly, steadily, until one day they forget you're there at all. And that's the part that hurts the most. Not that I wasn't thanked, not that I wasn't celebrated, but that I wasn't remembered. Not as a woman, not as a mother, not as a person who gave everything she had. I used to believe that sacrifice would echo, that the love you pour into people would seep into their bones, that even if they didn't say it, they'd feel it. But now I wonder if some people just absorb, take and take, until you're a hollow dot, and when they finally look at you, they see only the outline of what they once needed, not the woman who gave them everything she had, and then stayed to give more. There wasn't a single day it happened. That's the thing about quiet betrayals. They don't arrive with announcements. They settle in like dust, layer by layer, until one day you run your hand along a surface and realize you've been living in it far longer than you should have. It started, maybe with phone calls that stopped coming. Not all at once, no. Just enough missed rings and I'll call you back promises that turned into silence. I used to write little notes on the calendar when Haley said she'd FaceTime after school, just so I could be near the screen when she did. Eventually, I stopped bothering. Not because I was angry, but because I didn't want to keep setting a place for someone who never showed up. Birthdays came and went. One year, Celia forgot mine entirely. Jamie texted late that night, just a happy B-day. Mom, no call. No card. I stared at the message for a long time. It looked more like a password than a sentiment. I didn't write back. I kept a drawer of little gifts I'd buy when I thought of them. A puzzle for Haley's rainy days. A brooch Celia might have liked if she ever came around. But slowly, the drawer turned into a tomb. I couldn't bear to give them away, and I couldn't bear to keep trying. So I just let them sit there, still wrapped, still waiting for a moment that wouldn't come. What hurt wasn't their absence. It was how natural it became. How the sound of a Friday without a call, or a holiday morning without an invite stopped being jarring. It became the rhythm of things. And when silence becomes familiar, it changes you. They didn't see it the way I started shrinking. I stopped wearing lipstick. I stopped listening to my old records in the living room because the music felt like it was echoing in an empty church. I ate in the kitchen now, not the dining room, and I left the second plate in the cupboard. I used to keep up with the news, the world, even silly things like the local art fair schedules. I used to volunteer at the Historical Society, help catalog photos from the 1800s, back when people still looked straight at the camera like it might steal their souls. But somewhere along the way, I stopped showing up. I told them my knees were bothering me. The truth was, it hurt more to pretend I had somewhere to go. There was one day not too long ago, I remember clearly, a Saturday. I had made a pot of tea, the kind with little orange peels and cloves I used to serve when guests came by. No one had come in months, but I brewed it anyway, out of habit. The house was clean, the way it always is when you live alone. I sat at the window and watched the world walk by couples, dogs, children on bicycles. And I realized something odd. No one would notice if I disappeared for a few days. Or maybe longer. I'm not saying that for pity. I'm saying it because it was a truth I had to sit with, the kind of truth that chills you, not because it's tragic, but because it's quiet. They stopped asking about my health too. Not out of cruelty, just neglect. I could have been sick for months and no one would have known. I once had a small fall in the garden, nothing broken, just scraped pride. But I remember lying there, looking at the sky, wondering who I would call. Not who would answer, who I would even try to call. And I came up empty. I suppose I always believed that raising children meant building a circle, something that wrapped around you in old age, like a quilt. But now I see it differently. Children grow, yes. But some don't stay. Some build new circles and forget the ones they stood in first. What I had become in their lives was not a person, but a placeholder. The keeper of old photos, the voice that left long voicemails they never played. The woman who remembered everyone's allergies even when they forgot her birthday. They smiled at me in family pictures when they needed to post something nice, but in the spaces between snapshots, I was someone they'd already filed away. Present, but peripheral. I wasn't looking for grand gestures. I didn't need flowers or speeches or tributes. I just wanted to be asked, to be seen, to be considered. before plans were made. Not as an afterthought once RSVPs were settled. And the thing is, when you're erased slowly, it's not like being cut. It's like being sanded down, bit by bit, edge by edge, till what's left is a version of yourself. So faded, even the mirror struggles to recall you. There are still photos on my mantle. Jamie's graduation. Haley as a toddler in the sun hat I bought her from the fair in Maine. Celia on their wedding day looking past me. I don't take them down, not out of sentiment, but because they remind me. I was there. I gave what I had. I stood in those moments before they walked away, and maybe that's what still aches in the early mornings before the kettle whistles. Before the robins sing. The knowing that I loved them loudly. And they forgot me quietly. The final straw wasn't loud. It didn't come with slammed doors or screaming matches. It was fittingly quiet. Quiet I didn't expect. Not like that. It happened on a warm April afternoon. It's the kind of day when the breeze still holds a hint of winter, but the sun insists it's already summer. I had just returned from the community garden where I still kept a small plot. Tomatoes, marigolds, lavender. Simple things that didn't mind being left alone. When I walked into the house, I found the front hall oddly rearranged. The umbrella stand was missing. The wooden chest where I kept the winter scarves gone. First, I thought perhaps Jamie had taken it to refinish. He liked doing little woodworking projects, even if he rarely finished them. But as I walked through the house, the shift became undeniable. The walls felt bare. A few paintings are missing. And when I got to my bedroom, it was the jewelry box that told me something was wrong. The top drawer, which always stuck a little on the right side, slid out too easily. Empty. The small silver brush I'd inherited from my mother was gone. So was the ruby ring, the one I wore on my wedding day, the pearls I wore every Easter, the cameo brooch my grandmother smuggled in a hemline during the war. I sat on the edge of the bed, stunned. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't even angry. Not yet. Just hollow dot. It took 3 calls to reach Celia. When she finally answered, she sounded distracted, like she was folding laundry or writing an email. She spoke quickly, as if she'd expected me to find out. "Oh," she said. "We took a few things over to Haley's. She'll be using them soon anyway." "You always said they'd be hers." I don't recall saying that. Not in the way she meant it. Not in a way that meant take it now without asking. I said something about the brooch, about how it belonged to my grandmother and had been in our family for 4 generations. Celia sighed, the way one does when being corrected on an unimportant fact. "Mom, Haley's getting engaged. They want to pass on a few heirlooms early. It's tradition." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. I hadn't even been told Haley was in a serious relationship, let alone planning an engagement. And now they were picking through my belongings like a catalog. That night, I opened the side drawer of my desk and pulled out the envelope I kept for legal papers. In it were the title to the house, the will I had last updated 5 years ago, and a small stack of note cards in my husband's handwriting recipes, mostly, and little reminders. Fix the shutter before winter. Call Ellen Ree anniversary dinner. Helen, you're stronger than you know. I ran my fingers over the edges of those cards like they were scripture. The next morning, I called a lawyer. Not out of spite, out of clarity. It's because something had shifted, not just in my home, but in the structure of my love. I had poured and poured and poured into them for decades. But love without respect is just service. And I had become a servant. In my own life, when I asked the lawyer what my rights were, he was kind, gentle. He said, "You can do whatever you want with what's yours. That includes your house, your belongings, your name." That sentence echoed for days after. "What's yours?" I realized how long it had been since I'd truly claimed that word. What was mine? My thoughts, my silence, my memories, my sense of right and wrong even when it didn't match theirs. And yes, my jewelry, my choices, my boundaries. I sat with it all for weeks, didn't say a word to them. They didn't notice. No one called to check in or even thank me for the things they'd taken. The final line had been crossed not because they sold the jewelry, because they assumed they could. I began writing new letters, a new will, a new list of names, and when the museum accepted my donation, the small collection of historical jewelry. With my family's story stitched into each piece, I felt something click into place. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't even anger. It was a restoration of ownership. That ruby ring now sits behind glass, with a little plaque that reads, "Worn in 1956, passed through 4 generations of women. Donated in honor of Helen J. Monroe, who kept the memory alive." That was enough. I didn't speak to them after that. Not because I wanted to punish them. Silence was never meant to wound. I just didn't have anything left to say. There's a strange kind of freedom that comes with being invisible. Not the youthful kind. When you feel ignored at parties or overlooked at work, this is different. Kind of invisibility is earned. It happens after years of small erasures until finally you stop announcing your presence. You just step back. Okay, watch. I'm Helen Monroe, 71. And that was the moment I began to disappear. Not from the world, but from the version of me they believed they could control. Subscribe. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Thanks. After I donated the jewelry to the museum, I didn't call Celia. I didn't call Haley. I let them notice on their own or not. It didn't matter anymore. I spent more time at the library. I walked every aisle slowly, as if retracing the shape of my own mind. I started journaling again. Nothing fancy. Just a small leather-bound notebook and a fountain pen my late husband once gave me. I wrote whatever came. Old memories, grocery lists, recipes for stews I no longer made. It helped. Not in a dramatic way, but like a stone warming in the sun. Little by little, the frost melted. I kept going to the community garden. That patch of dirt became my sanctuary. I planted zinnias, red ones, loud, joyful, defiant things. I trimmed them weekly and brought a few home to place by the window, where the morning light made them glow like embers. And while I didn't speak to them, I did start listening differently. Listening to myself. I pulled out the old financial folder I'd kept buried in the bottom drawer. I updated passwords, moved a few things, spoke to a financial advisor recommended by the museum. She was younger than I expected, kind-eyed and efficient. She said, "You have more choices than you think." That sentence sat with me, the way "what's yours" had before. I started to imagine a different rhythm to my days. One that didn't involve waiting for birthdays or holidays or watching my phone screen for texts that never came. I made tea at 3 p.m. just because I liked how the light fell on the table then. I bought a used record player and played Billie Holiday on Sundays, letting her voice fill the corners of the house that had been silent for too long. I cleaned out the attic, not out of spite, but because I didn't want to leave a mess for someone else to sort through. I found baby shoes, my wedding veil, a letter I wrote in 1983 that I never sent, folded twice. The ink slightly blurred from tears. I barely remembered crying. In my silence, I began to understand something. They didn't know me. Not really. Not the girl who wrote poems in the margins of her college textbooks. Not the woman who danced barefoot on the lawn with their father after dinner. Not the mother who stayed up all night sewing a Halloween costume from old curtains, because the store-bought one had sold out. They only knew the version of me who gave, who agreed, who didn't correct them when they rewrote history in their own favor. That woman had been exhausted for a long time. I started writing again, real writing, little essays, reflections. I sent one into a local newsletter under a pseudonym, The Invisible Thread. They printed it. A kind editor emailed to say it had touched her. That was enough to keep going. When people in town asked how the family was, I smiled and said, growing in their own ways. Just the truth. I had no updates to offer, and they rarely asked for any. I had not disappeared. Out of anger, I had simply reclaimed my quiet. You see, people assume silence means defeat, but sometimes it means control. Sometimes it means dignity. I didn't owe anyone an explanation for the things I chose to protect, not even myself. I Remembered a line from a book I once loved: "When you no longer need to be seen, you can finally see." And I did. I saw things I had missed for years. The way my neighbor always refilled the bird bath with warm water on cold mornings. The soft way the mailman tapped the box so I'd hear it even when I forgot to check. The slow, devoted companionship. Of time by winter, the house felt like mine again. Not because anyone had asked to leave, but because I had stopped waiting for them to return. I still spoke to the walls sometimes, out loud, about nothing in particular. Told the curtains how beautiful they looked in the amber light. I told the teapot she'd done her job well. I thanked the rug for warming my feet, and I thanked myself, quietly, for staying. I stopped speaking, but I didn't disappear. There's a difference between going silent and being gone. One is retreat, the other is erasure. And I'd already been erased from too many conversations, too many photos, too many plans that never included me. I chose retreat. I began each morning with purpose. Small, unglamorous things. I cleared out the attic on my own. It was hotter than I expected up there, and dust danced in the air like a quiet warning. I went through every box, every yellowed folder, every photograph. Not to reminisce, but to release. I shredded papers that no longer served me. Old bills? Birthday cards from people who now wrote me out of their lives in one corner. I found a small wooden box I hadn't opened in years. Inside was my mother's locket, a faded corsage, and a tiny porcelain swan I remembered dusting as a girl. I placed them in a fresh cloth-lined case. They were mine. Not because of ownership, but because I still remembered their stories. That summer I walked every morning, round the same streets where I used to push Jamie's stroller, and later where Celia would ride her bike ahead of me, fearless and fast. The pavement hadn't changed, but I had. I started noticing the sound of my steps, the gentle ache in my knee, and the way the sunlight slipped through maple branches. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't hurrying toward anyone else's. Knees. I stopped picking up the phone when I saw their names. Not out of pettiness, but peace. I told myself if it was urgent, they'd leave a message. They rarely did. That silence taught me more than any argument ever could. I read more. I cooked less. I started setting the table for one and making it. Beautiful cloth napkin, fresh flour from the yard, glass of chilled elderflower water. I used to cook for 5, sometimes 10. Now I cooked for a woman who had earned every bite. I didn't skimp on dessert. There was one morning midsummer when I sat in the garden with a letter from my attorney. It confirmed that the property transfer had gone through. I now coned the deed with a local historical trust, ensuring it couldn't be sold or passed without shared review. That house, my home, would remain a place of meaning, not an asset to be bartered at a dinner table. I breathed deeply. The lavender bloomed just behind me. I didn't call to tell them. That silence was not bitterness, it was dignity. 2 weeks later, I began volunteering at the local archive center. It was small, tucked behind the library, filled with boxes of unsorted town records. I didn't mention my family. I just showed up, wore gloves, and handled the past with care. Some documents were nearly 2 centuries old, fragile, faded, yet still legible. Time had not erased them. A young woman named Elise worked there part-time. She reminded me of Haley in some ways, but quieter, less entitled. She once asked me how long I'd lived in the area, and I told her long enough to know what matters. That made her smile. The first time I walked into that museum and saw my grandmother's brooch beneath the glass, something strange happened. I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel triumphant either. I felt present. That story would not be rewritten. That memory would not be taken. And I didn't need to explain it to anyone. They hadn't reached out. Not once. Not even when the museum sent out its quarterly newsletter with my name in the donor column. Perhaps they didn't notice. Or perhaps they didn't care. But that no longer dictated my worth. Instead, I began reclaiming small rituals. I wore lipstick to the post office. I bought a new kettle just because the old one whined. I changed the curtains in the guest room, not because anyone was coming, but because I liked the soft green fabric. I wasn't rebuilding to be seen. I was rebuilding to be whole. Power doesn't always come from confrontation. Sometimes it comes from restraint, from boundaries redrawn without fanfare, from names crossed off lists, not with anger, but with precision. They had taken things, but they couldn't take me, and I had finally stopped giving myself away. They noticed only when it cost them something, not right away. No, at first, my absence was just space they could stretch into. One less person to invite, one less obligation, one less chair to set. But absence, when it's real and rooted, starts to echo. Celia was the first to reach out. A short message. Stiff and impersonal, asking about a bank account she thought I'd still be managing. I didn't reply. The next week she sent another message. That one was angrier, accusing me of cutting her out, of being unfair. Unfair. That word stayed with me longer than it strawed. I had been the one to pay her rent after her divorce. I had driven for hours to babysit so she could attend retreats and parties. I had written checks without keeping records. I had let them speak over me, take my time, my savings, my pride, and never once asked for it back, now without me. The cracks began to show. Celia told the family I was acting strange, that I was not well. But the truth was, I had never been clearer. And they didn't know how to react to a version of me they couldn't control. I heard through a neighbor that Jamie's promotion had fallen through, that he'd borrowed against property he assumed would be his, that there were legal delays now, complications with the house title. I didn't gloat. But I didn't offer help either. What they lost without me wasn't just financial. 'Twas structure, ritual, the glue between holidays, the card in the mailbox, the extra key, emergency contact, the quiet scaffolding of a woman they believed would always be available. Even the museum exhibit, just a small corner in a glass case, began drawing attention. The curator sent me a photo one day of a group of students huddled around the display. There was my grandmother's necklace, my mother's hairbrush, the brooch, the plaque read, gifted by M.C. Wellesley in memory of a lineage passed through hands that remembered. Celia posted a vague complaint on social media about family heirlooms being stolen from their rightful place. A friend sent me the screenshot. It was strange. How people could claim ownership of something they never asked about until it became unavailable. Jamie sent a letter, a real one, in the mail. He called me mother in the greeting. Not mom, not mom. It was formal, detached. He asked if we could talk, said he missed me, that he'd been overwhelmed. I read it twice, folded it carefully, and placed it in the drawer where I kept receipts. The hardest part wasn't staying away. Was remembering how easily I had once tolerated being an afterthought. What they lost without me wasn't visible. At first, it wasn't measured in tears or apologies, which emptier gatherings, louder silences, meals that felt slightly off without my knowing hands, forgotten birthdays, anniversaries no one else bothered to recall. Haley, my granddaughter, had started college by then. I knew where, but I never reached out. I figured she needed to see a life unfold without manipulation disguised as inheritance. I had become a ghost they couldn't accuse, a presence they couldn't predict, and in that absence, found peace. I watched the seasons change from my kitchen window, the same view. I'd once seen while stirring soups and icing cakes for birthdays that were barely acknowledged. I now watched it for myself. There was a fullness in solitude. Not loneliness, that had long passed, but fullness. The way the wind moved through the grass, the way light shifted across the bookshelf at noon. Things greeted me without condition. I didn't go to the next family gathering. I wasn't invited anyway. But I imagined the moment someone would ask, did she ever call back? And someone else would reply, no, she didn't. And maybe, just maybe, they'd begin to wonder why. Because when you remove the person who always gave, always stayed, always bent, you start to feel the imbalance. Not right away, but slowly, like the way a house settles, with creaks and cracks that no one can trace. They lost my warmth, yes, but they also lost the witness to their better selves, the version of them that was kinder in my company. And I lost the version of me who had settled. I no longer watered dead plants, and I no longer explained my absence. I found the box again in early autumn. It had been tucked behind a row of books. On the lowest shelf, a place I hadn't touched in years, was small, wrapped in faded floral paper, the edges yellowing. I knew what was inside before I even opened it. Letters, mostly unsent. Some dated back decades. My handwriting, younger. Neater, filled with hope. One was addressed to my husband the day after our firstborn was released from the hospital. Another, written in the thick of our financial troubles, was never mailed because I'd chosen instead to sit beside him in silence, thinking that love would be enough. And there were others. One to Jamie on the night he turned 16 and slammed the door behind him. Another to Celia when I saw her checking my medicine cabinet and whispering that I was slipping. But the one I pulled out that day had no name on the front. Just a date. January 12th, 1999. It was the day after my mother died. I remember writing it late at night, the kitchen table, while everyone else slept. I had lit a candle for her, for myself, and let the pen move without thinking. I read it now, all these years later, and the words felt unfamiliar, like they'd been written by a woman who still believed she had time to be understood. I don't think anyone sees me clearly, it began. I move around this house like I'm made of air. They love what I do, not who I am. I paused and pressed the letter to my chest. So much of my life had been spent in quiet service, showing up, preparing, absorbing, and never asking for much in return. And yet here, in black ink, was a woman pleading to be known, not just remembered, for the cakes she baked or the holidays she hosted, but for her laughter, her loneliness, her stories that had no audience. That day, I didn't add the letter to the others. I didn't put it back. Instead, I wrote a new one. I didn't start it with "Dear" or "To." I just began. If you're reading this, it means I finally chose myself. I wrote slowly, choosing my words like stones in a garden path. I wanted every sentence to feel solid, deliberate. I know I was expected to endure, to nod, to smile, to pass the serving plate. I know I was easier to love when I kept quiet, when I stayed available, when I asked for nothing. I paused, looked out the window, then kept going. But silence taught me more than they ever did. Silence showed me where my real boundaries were, where I ended and they began. I remembered every time I bit my tongue to keep peace, every time I smiled when I wanted to scream, every time I gave, not out of love but out of fear that if I didn't, I'd disappear completely. And in the end, I had disappeared anyway, slowly, softly, until I became convenient. So I kept writing. I do not regret what I gave. I regret what I gave up. I wrote about the jewelry, how it had never really been about diamonds or gold, but about memory, about the scent of my mother's perfume when she fastened that brooch, the way my grandmother's hands trembled when she passed down her ring. Those pieces carried more than tradition, they carried breath. I wrote about the museum, too. It felt like giving them back to the women who wore them first. It felt like I was saying we were here, we mattered. By the time I folded the letter, the sun had dipped low and cast long golden shadows across the floor. I didn't seal it. I placed it gently in the same box, now stripped of the old paper. Then I took the whole thing to the fireplace. I watched the flame take it slowly, the corners curling, the ink blurring, the final sentence glowing before vanishing. I wasn't angry. I was finally empty, and that was beautiful. It wasn't a revenge letter. It wasn't a cry for forgiveness. It was a soft release. It's a way to let go without leaving jagged edges. After the ashes cooled, I took them to the garden and scattered. Then beneath the rosemary bush. That night, I slept without dreams. Sometimes closure isn't found in confrontation. It's found in ink, in fire, in the act of turning something once held tightly into something that no longer needs to be carried. That letter didn't change them, it changed me. My life is quiet now, and that's enough. Most mornings begin before the sun. I wake when the light is still silver and soft, when the birds haven't quite decided to sing yet. The kettle hums on the stove the way it always has. And I sit at the small table by the window, watching the steam rise like breath from the earth itself. There is no rush anymore. No calendar pinned with grandchildren's birthdays. I won't be invited to. It's no expectation to cook for gatherings that pass without mention of my name. Just time. Wide, uninterrupted time. And I've made peace with its silence. The garden is my sanctuary. It isn't much, a patch of soil, a crooked trellis, a few scattered blooms, but it grows with me. I planted lavender last spring, not for its color, but for its scent. I like how it lingers on my hands long after I've brushed against it. Like a gentle presence that doesn't demand anything back. There's rosemary, too, over the ashes of that letter. It's thriving now, tall and fragrant, and some days I think the soil remembers. That it holds stories just like I do. Quiet, buried, but still pulsing with meaning. People ask if I ever get lonely. Lonely is different from being alone. Loneliness feels like waiting, like hoping someone might remember you. But I'm not waiting anymore. Simply here. There's a rhythm to solitude that took time to learn. At first, I filled it with noise, the radio, the television, the humming of appliances. But slowly, I learned to let the silence speak, to let it stretch out and reveal things I hadn't noticed in years. The way light lands differently at 4 o'clock than it does at 7, the sound of the gates swaying on windy afternoons, the comfort in cooking for one dot. I keep a journal now, just a simple notebook with a green cloth cover. Some entries are long, others are just lines. Thoughts I never had the space to say aloud. Like they say, blood is thicker than water. But neither flows toward you when the well is dry. Or even a door left unlocked won't be opened by someone who never planned a knock. I don't write them to be wise. I write them to be whole. I've also started walking again. It's just up the lane and back. I nod to the same cat sunning itself on the fence post, wave to the postman who never asks questions. Cake. And when she asked about my children, I told her I once had a family. I didn't. Say more. She didn't press. The truth is, I do still think of them. Not with bitterness, that's gone now, but with a kind of weathered wonder. Like when you drive past an old house you used to live in. You remember the shape of it, the color of the door, but you no longer feel the pull to go inside. Don't know what they say about me now. I imagine the jewelry is still a topic of confusion. Maybe they think I've grown eccentric with age. Maybe they believe I acted out of spite, but I didn't. I acted out of clarity, out of love, not for them, but for the woman I had almost forgotten to be. That museum display went up in July. Anonymously, a week after the opening. I stood there for a long while, just staring at the glass. Had done a beautiful job. My grandmother's brooch gleamed under the light. My mother's ring rested on a velvet square. There was a little plaque with my name on it, etched in delicate brass. I saw my family history framed with reverence, not as something to be claimed, but as something to be honored, and I thought to myself, this not ownership, not entitlement, but memory preserved, respected, shared. I walked out of that museum lighter than I'd felt in years. Now, when the sky begins to darken and the shadows stretch across the floor, I don't reach for the phone. Apologies. I have rosemary. I have ink. I have air that moves through open windows without needing permission. I have peace. I wasn't angry. I was finally empty, and that was beautiful.